Hi, my name is Reverend Jaron Green. I'm the senior pastor of the Union Baptist Church and a proud brother of the Epsilon Gamma Lambda chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. During the 1930s, African Americans had the right to vote, but they weren't voting. Why? Because of poll taxes, threats of reprisal, and just a lack of education about the voting process altogether. From then until now, voter education and engagement has been a dominant focus of this, the greatest fraternity on God's green earth, Alpha Phi Alpha. For over 60 years, as it will remain, we're going to focus on voter education, voter engagement, and just awareness in the political process. Today, in 2021, we are happy to engage with those who lead in the city of Boston, especially with those who are seeking to become the next mayor of Boston. As alphas, we are concerned and caring and curious advocates, and we want to know. So, we are excited to sit with Michelle Wu. Boston City Councilor Michelle Wu has served for over 7 years on the City Council. She is a wife, a mom, a daughter of immigrants, an attorney, an advocate, and she is a candidate for the office of mayor of the city of Boston. Michelle, we're so happy to sit and speak with you today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
In your almost 8 years as a Boston City Councilor, you have authored and passed legislation that affects all communities in Boston, but especially communities of color. Legislation around paid parental leave and language access and healthcare equity, ramping up renewable energy and reforming city contracting. I think my first question is, why are you so passionate about this work?
You know, it's funny because I never thought growing up that I would be involved in any of this. Not government, especially not the politics. As you mentioned, I am the daughter of immigrants. My parents came from Taiwan to the US. I'm the oldest kid. And so for much of my childhood, they didn't speak English fluently. And as soon as I learned English in school, I was kind of pushed out in front as the official translator for the family anytime we were going out in public. And it always felt like there was such a gap, such a barrier between feeling like you would be seen or heard, much less represented and reflected in government. My life got more intense with my family when my mom began to struggle with serious mental illness as she was becoming a single mom. And I ended up raising my two sisters through that, becoming caregiver for her. And so this unexpected journey for me really came about because that bubble my parents were trying to construct around me of just don't worry about government, keep your head down, try not to get in trouble with anything. It burst when all of a sudden we were dealing with government policies all the time. Healthcare and trying to get my mom the care she needed, schools and taking care of my sisters, opening a small family business, a little restaurant to keep us going, and having to fight one way after another. And so I've seen how big the gaps are for families and how much city government can actually make a difference if we decide to take action.
Your story is absolutely amazing, and I think it speaks directly to the heart. I'm so happy that you shared with us and are sharing with the city of Boston. Your family owned a small business. We're sitting here in a small business, which are really the backbone. It's the backbone of Boston's economy that's recovering right now. This restaurant that we're sitting in, it is a cultural hub of this small community, right? I have a question for you. How will you protect the cultural hubs of Boston? How do you create new opportunities for economic empowerment so that some other family who was in your position can now think about what you're doing right now?
That's right. It's funny, as we're sitting down at this table, it's kind of similar shape to the ones that we had, and I just have memories of, scrubbing them down and being the person in the back running the cash register. How much work goes into and how much love and care goes into running a small business, because when you're on the other side of it, it's not just about making, of course, you got to feed your family, you got to keep those dollars coming in the door. But it is truly a labor of love to be a neighborhood small business owner, creating the right community space, picking the perfect color of paint on the wall, the playlist where people will feel welcome. And our businesses are really about that connection point where economic opportunity meets culture, meets community. And so I see our small businesses really as the foundation of how we bring people together in our neighborhoods. The pandemic has been devastating, right? It's been devastating, particularly for locally owned businesses who don't have that extra cushion that large chains might have financially. It's been devastating for businesses owned by entrepreneurs of color. There was already such a small number of businesses with liquor licenses that were owned by Black Bostonians, I think 8 restaurants total. And to see what people have had to go through over 16 months now of unpredictability, struggle, supply chains disrupted, we need to do everything we can to support and wrap around our small businesses, not just because of everything they've gone through, but because of where we need to go together. Our city is totally changed now. The economy of every city is kind of upended, right? You don't need to be sitting right here in this room with us to be watching this conversation. You don't need to be sitting in the cubicle next to your coworker to be able to go and have a meeting together. And so as this relationship between where you live, where you work, how you commute is all upended, cities need to be the place where we are transforming what you can only get in person, right? Restaurants, arts, and culture. That has to be how we shape our recovery. And the role of the mayor of Boston and city government and building community has to recognize that this is a lifeline for immigrant families, for families of color, for communities to find their identity and feel connected to each other. So there's much more at stake than just those dollar and cents.
So it is very clear, just in this conversation that we've begun to have, that there's more behind the scenes that we need to talk about as it relates to closing what I'm hearing you say is a wealth gap. And let's just be real.
That's right.
There is a racial wealth gap through institutional racism, through discriminatory policies, redlining, segregation. Black and brown citizens have been systematically denied the rights and the access to building generational wealth.
That's right.
Some that start in small businesses. It's not a theory, it is a fact. It's not a fairy tale. It's the unfortunate, provable facts of life right here in the city of Boston, not down south somewhere. So my question for you, Michelle, is, are you prepared and equipped to address and dismantle systems that have widened the racial wealth gap?
That's right. And to recognize that Boston's gap is one of the largest anywhere in the country. That is, as you mentioned, the product of systems that have been built up and reinforced and perpetuated through policy, right? Through the active choices of our government over time. And it's going to take that kind of intentional, active choice right now through government and through community partnerships to take that apart. But we have to recognize that to meet this moment in Boston, as we're trying to rebuild our public health infrastructure, as we're trying to get our businesses back open, as we're trying to stabilize families in their homes with the evictions moratorium expiring soon and people trying to find their ways to get back to work while still plugging in holes with childcare and everything else, that every way we were measuring disparities prior to the pandemic has gotten deeper, has gotten bigger. And we can't just restore what was there before, because our communities of color, BIPOC residents in Boston, were already in crisis long before COVID-19. And so for me, this is about getting to the root causes. Right? We can spend a lot of energy, a lot of resources, a lot of time trying to put Band-Aids on situations or plug the leaks in different parts, when what we need to do is rise up to meet the moment and use this historic opportunity. We have federal funding coming down, momentum from state and federal government to say, we are going to transform the systems in our city to what they should have been long before this pandemic.
What's the first step?
Yeah, so when it comes to the racial wealth gap in particular, we hear the stats a lot. And I think it's always important to point out that that gap is in the scale that to some folks is, when you hear it for the first time, shockingly, unconscionably large of $250,000 worth of a racial wealth gap, right? The bulk of that is differences in home ownership. And then there's also differences in business ownership. And so the question is, how do we make sure we can generate wealth for our communities, for Black and brown residents to build up and pass down to future generations? On the business side, I've been proud to be fighting on this, leading the way for more than 5 years now, that the City of Boston's very first ordinance, when it came to accountability and measuring and then changing how we give out city contracts, was because of my partnership with then Councilor Ayanna Pressley, of course, our amazing Congresswoman, where we wrote that ordinance saying we need to know how our tax dollars are being spent. And that first report that came out after we subpoenaed the information, 0.65% of the city's taxpayer dollars in contracts were going to businesses owned by people of color. Now with more pushing and pushing, it's up to 2.5% in a city that is majority people of color. We cannot accept the current goal that's been set of just a 10% goal, right? We should be aiming to be leading the country here. Other cities have figured it out and are doing multiples more than us. Chicago, well over 20%. Philadelphia, well over 30%. We should be leading the way and aiming for our goal to be reflective of our population. And then when it comes to home ownership, now's the moment. Housing instability, the crisis that people feel, how do we afford to stay? This is the number one issue I hear all across the communities, knocking on doors, at meetings. And so let's use the resources we have, again, not just to divvy it up in small pockets and funding here and there to make an announcement about this or that, but to really have transformational change by centering housing stability and boosting home ownership to close these gaps.
Michelle, you mentioned housing affordability, and I just want to talk about that for a moment. Only about a third of Boston residents own their own home. That's crazy. And about half of Boston renters are rent burdened. When you consider the economic disparities in Boston, it's safe to probably say that nobody feels that burden more than Black and brown people. So what is your commitment to making Boston a more livable city?
The biggest thing is that we have to take responsibility. For too long, city government has said, we're a growing city, gentrification's a byproduct of that, or, I wish we could do more, but the state and federal government aren't funding affordable housing. What can we do? No, this is the moment for city government to lean into our power, of course, to push and partner with other levels of government, but to realize all the tools that we have to take action right now. And so our plan has a couple big pieces to it. First is to really lean in, use the resources we have. We own vacant land. We own buildings. We own parcels of land that could be redeveloped, even if it's a one-story library that is starting to show signs of age. It's a couple decades old. When it needs to be rebuilt and fixed up, let's put affordable housing on top that is climate resilient for home ownership for our residents. So they're living in the most energy efficient, affordable housing, won't have to pay utilities. When we have the chance to think about how we permit and allow new development through our zoning code, let's make sure that we're expediting affordable housing so we're not using up the costs on process and attorneys and all the complications when it should be keeping housing more affordable. And then with this federal relief package, I'm the only candidate who has said, I guarantee, I commit to housing being the foundation of how we use those funds. At least $200 million is going to go to building that affordable housing, speeding up the process, and increasing home ownership. We can continue to support down payment assistance for residents, particularly first-generation home buyers, particularly Black and brown residents and families. We can also lead the way on new mechanisms of financing. I've been pushing for what we're calling a municipal home ownership voucher. Right now, we help renters with their monthly rent through voucher programs, but then at the end of the day, people aren't built. They're spending more of their income on rent than they would if they were paying a mortgage and actually building up that equity and generational wealth. And so we can be creative and proactive about how we really lean in on housing. And the other thing I really want to point out as a clear distinction among the field as well is that, it's undisputed. We need to do everything we can to increase the supply of housing, there are just simply not enough places that are affordable for our residents to live. But it takes years to build new housing developments, and to say, well, just wait while you're getting pushed out in the process is unacceptable. I'm the only candidate in this race who is committed to and publicly said, I support rent stabilization. I support getting the tools from the state, call it rent control, call it rent stabilization, but the ability for city government to act, just like we would in any other area, to use every tool we have to keep our families here, while we're also using every other tool to increase the supply. And so people can both have more options, but also not be afraid of displacement and getting pushed out.
The COVID-19 pandemic has rocked our world. It has revealed so many things. We've been speaking about the racial wealth gap, but we can talk about the health gap. We can talk about the deep health disparities by race and also by neighborhood. And that brings a real affliction to our communities, communities that are already burdened with gun exposure, violence, environmental hazards, and all of these destabilizing factors. We have a homelessness epidemic that's going on. We have an opioid epidemic that's going on. I've heard the candidates speak about mass and caste. I'm thinking, how will you fight for health equity in the city of Boston?
This is an area that has shaped my life, right? I wouldn't be here sitting with you today or anywhere near government if I hadn't seen firsthand how big the gaps can be with families as you're struggling to care for a loved one. In our case, living with serious mental illness, but often in unexpected ways and sudden changes where your life is completely turned upside down because of barriers to healthcare. Even in the city that is known as the Mecca, right, with the best expertise and resources and institutions in the world when it comes to healthcare, we still see the same gaps deepened, especially during the pandemic. We still see the institutional racism, structural racism reflected in how our residents and residents of color in particular experience healthcare within that system or see themselves reflected in the workforce of that system. So for me, health is really all encompassing. It is health and wealth and education. That's the whole way that government can touch people's lives. Health is housing, whether you first and foremost have a place to live, that you feel secure, that you are not worrying, that doesn't have conditions that are triggering asthma or other health conditions. Health is climate and the air that you breathe. And we know that in Massachusetts, the most polluted census tract anywhere in the state is in Chinatown, surrounded by all the highways, but that the Asian American community's disproportionate exposure to polluted air is only just right behind, followed by Black and Latinx communities, right? So people of color all across the state are breathing in every day the impacts of systemic racism as well. We know that health is also safety and resources to address violence in our communities and the trauma that ripples out. So the way that you could describe my leadership on almost everything is as a mom, right? When you are a mom in charge of your two most precious little beings, it is the very short term. How do we make sure that they are healthy, safe, fed, happy emotionally, but also that in the long term, growing to be the people they deserve to be, that they have the potential to step into. And that's the kind of intersectional approach we need. We have all the resources in the world for health, literally. We have the best options. It's about breaking down those barriers and understanding how all of our policy areas fit together, and we need to be tackling that in conjunction with the resources that we have.
Michelle, you're a mom. I am a father, happy about it. Many of the brothers of Alpha, we are fathers, and we also represent and advocate for other children who are not our own. And education is important to us as parents. We want the best for our kiddos. Improving education for the sake of our children is top priority for Black families, for all people of color, for all people, period. We're concerned about the equitable, quality education across all of Boston's schools, not just the selective exam schools. So I have a question for you as we begin to wrap up our time together. How will you as mayor begin to work so that students and teachers and families have an educational system in Boston that is responsive to their needs and provides a type of support that enables all of us to be successful?
You know, my plans for education have been called by some in the media pie in the sky. They are aiming for what we dream of for our kids. And I would expect nothing less from our leaders. I know how important this is. In my own life, education has opened doors that I never imagined. My immigrant parents, this was the entire focus of the family, right? Every time my dad got a job that paid more, they'd uproot the family and try to find a public school district with that next smallest house they could afford. And so I was always the kid in classrooms with holes in my shoes next to classmates who had much more resources in their lives. But I got to be in those science labs and performing arts classes and that sense of what's possible through public education that's part of the promise of this country. I've been involved in the Boston Public Schools now for a decade. First raising my sisters, my younger sister through middle school and high school, and then now starting over on the young end with my two little guys who are going to be in first grade and K1 this September at the Sumner School. And I know that sometimes it feels like a tightrope that you have to walk as a parent. There are some amazing opportunities in BPS, but you feel like every lottery, every enrollment decision, every choice has such high stakes to it because that quality and those resources are not distributed across the board equitably. And so I have taken the time as a counselor to try to just get into every single school and see what it's like, hear from our educators and school leaders. I visited every single Boston Public High School, specifically on a fact-finding mission just to spend time with the school nurses, with school leaders. What do we need? What should our city be delivering? And then visiting elementary school and middle schools as well. And you see the gaps. You see how wide the differences are. Some schools, gorgeous, well-resourced, every program you could imagine. Some schools where the kids don't have doors on the stalls of the bathrooms or drinking fountains that have clean water coming out of them because of lead pipes, much less the scale of science labs and performing arts spaces that our kids deserve. And so our schools plan has 4 main pieces to it, built up from community and from all of these visits and learning directly from those who are most impacted. First, we have to start earlier. We've got to close the gap when it comes to early education. The most important years of our kiddos' lives, we are pretending like kids don't exist until they're 5, and magically then we pay for their education. So Boston's legacy is we have to do that, and we can. Number 2 is really having a whole child, whole community approach. Our schools should be the platform for every other service and program that the city of Boston can offer for young people and their families. And so I would create a system to wrap around each child the moment they enter our district all the way through, so that family never has to worry about help they could get from other parts of the city, rental assistance, food access, mental health supports. They will get it proactively through the school system. The third is facilities. We deserve for our kids to be in world-class inspirational buildings. And then last but not least, vocational education. The jobs that are available, right? The workforce shortages that we're seeing now. Our kids, our young people, our community members have every right to step into these jobs. And we need to do our part from city government in mapping out those pathways, not just to the jobs here today, but the jobs that we should be shaping for tomorrow.
Michelle, we want to say thank you. The brothers of the Epsilon Gamma Lambda chapter of the Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, we thank you. We're the Boston Alphas. You should know us by now. We enjoy spending time with you. And here's my final question. Are you the right choice for Boston?
You know, I've been saying for a long time that I have full faith and confidence in our democracy and, more importantly, in Boston's communities. If people come out to vote, if we see turnout representing the scale of energy that I feel around the community, that people are ready for Boston to be leading the way, are ready to think about the big changes we can bring about, I feel good that the right choice will be made. And of course, I'm here to present myself as the candidate for mayor, the one who is pushing for bold ideas, the one who's pushing for urgency, for partnership with community, to reflect the stakes that our families are living as a mom, as a caregiver, as someone who has lived the challenges. But above all, I believe that Boston doesn't need a savior. It's not about the one person who's going to go in a room by themselves and voters make a choice and then get what happens. This is about opening up the doors of City Hall wide so that everyone sees themselves reflected, is directly empowered and connected to be part of our decision making, part of shaping our future. And I'm confident that when we get to that place of every community being part of government, there's no stopping what Boston can do.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being part of this conversation with City Councilor Michelle Wu, candidate for the office of mayor in the city of Boston. The brothers of the Epsilon Gamma Lambda chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, we thank you, we appreciate you, and we'll be back. We are caring, concerned, and curious advocates, and we want to know.